Gran Turismo 3.
A long time ago in the early boom of the gaming industry, developers and publishers were pushing all kinds of crazy ideas to fill in the gaps in the market and to stand out amongst their competitors. But as time goes on, bigger and wilder ideas become harder to fund with the massive cost of video game development, causing a lot of developers to go ahead and make some safe products for profits, overly relying on graphics and celebrities to bring in new audiences, leaving a massive gap in the market for more wacky and zany ideas. Fortunately, thanks to the massive development in video game engines and massive information archive on the internet, video game development has been made easier for a lot of newcomers. We're now seeing the rise of great games only being built by less than 10 people, and in some cases only one sole developer putting their passion into one single project. After all, if the massive corporations don't give us what we want, then what are we supposed to do other than make it ourselves? With so many indie racing games out there, I was only able to pick a handful of them for this video. So if there are any that I might have missed out on, do let me know in the comments down below. Now, one thing I want to mention before we get into this video, creators like myself and others usually get developer keys on their emails, and while I did have a few free keys that I could have used for this project, I instead just purchased anything that I could. It was mainly just to support the developers for making all kinds of indie racing games and helping out the scene. And if you want to support any of these developers you see today, feel free to buy their game on Steam. But first, we have Inertial Drift, a racing game about, well, drifting.
You have the usual races, time trials, and whatnot, but this game also has its own drift controls. Rather than just steering normally and letting the car's momentum make it go sideways, you instead have this. The game essentially uses both controller analog for the gameplay, with the right analog being used to control the tilt angle, with mastery of both becoming important for the game's handling model. It'll take a while to get used to, especially in the later tracks when things get a whole lot crazier with the hairpin corners, featured from the game's story mode, challenges, arcade, and Grand Prix modes, with a surprising addition of a split screen mode if you got a buddy to play with physically. The story mode itself is presented as a visual novel with the choice to pick who to play, tying the choice to car selection with their different driving style. Due to them not being licensed, however, the developers get to play around with the car designs. Most will have clear inspirations just from the moment you lay eyes on them, while the remaining vehicle available may or may not remind you of cars from titles like Burnout or Ridge Racer instead, and they've been mostly modified to fit in this retro-futuristic setting, giving them blocky body kits to resemble something out of the cyberpunk-style visual design and split into 3 different classifications to indicate their performance level. Throughout the career itself, the task comes with usually having to beat the designated events in a linear manner. It can be a bit tedious, but luckily both time trials and ghost battles can be finished very quickly, either just by beating the goal target time in ghost battle, or exiting the race in time trial mode after hitting the goal target. The score system in the game itself is also pretty unique, as it doesn't follow the usual rules you'd see for drifting in video games. They don't penalize you until you get a big hit to the wall, even give you extra scores for grinding the rails. It doesn't necessarily make the game super easy, as the later tracks are quite difficult to master, but it does increase the depth of mastery that could be applied for drifting. Mastery that will come in handy for some other race events like the race duels and many others. For challenges in arcades, it's mostly the same, exception being with challenges forcing you onto fixed cars and characters for each event, and arcade being the polar opposite. And Grand Prix makes you do 5 challenges back to back in any car of your choice. However, you will need to progress through the story mode first to unlock more challenges. The game itself takes place in a world bathed by the physical embodiment of retro synthwave, with neon lit vistas and glorious sunset at the edges of the world. It's not so overbearing to burn your eyes out, as most of the environment still has its natural colors in place, giving the retro synth style to pop out a bit more along with the game's use of lighting, with the neons to indicate barriers, cones, and checkpoints, making it harder to miss them, utilizing its cel-shaded graphics to the fullest extent, covering not only the characters but also the cars themselves, with a UI interface that looks somewhat similar to the Wipeout series, although it's not exactly perfect as some characters look pretty uncanny. Other than these small issues, there's nothing much to complain about the game. There's a ton of creative track design for a drift racer, catering to both circuit and point-to-point races alike, all to complement the game's drift-centric gameplay. The only criticism I would have is probably with some tracks being eerily quiet and empty, like the city tracks, which ends up making the game's world feel a bit dead. But the music itself is pretty good, and there's additional content with new stories, cars, and rivals to beat with the Twilight Rivals DLC.
This game is one of the most unique drift games that I've seen in a while, mostly due to its control and art style that it offers. so I definitely recommend it if you're a fan of drift games or the type to vibe with this type of art style. For the next game we have Heading Out, a roguelike driving game with a unique art style and presentation to it.
With the task of progressing through the states of America, often from one end to the other while being chased by a so-called fear that is spreading out throughout the map as time progresses. Depending on the action and choices that you make, the campaign will play out differently, as players are tasked to deal with several resources as you go along and choose the preferred morality to gain specific advantages and obstacles. When it comes to the driving department, however, there isn't much, as it mostly consists of driving through a randomized set piece, police chase, or simple races, designed mostly to complement the roguelike element without shaking things too far. The art style is arguably the one thing this game got going well. A cel-shaded world with only a couple of colors you'll ever see throughout the game, alongside the monochrome world with its oppressive red that supposedly represents the main character's fear, as it constantly chases you throughout the whole campaign, changing the once monotone map into this dread-inducing blood red. Let it block all your paths and this is essentially game over. The game's use of colors is also very specific and simple to catch on. Anything red you'd want to avoid, and anything yellow can either showcase important information such as race opponents, the speedometer, incoming pace notes, and the small use of blue colors to indicate a source of safety with the goal and radio broadcast. Other visual cues can come from comic panel-esque interfaces, allowing you to tell how much you're accelerating, but mostly used to represent the storytelling of the game, with each race and driving duration is determined by the song duration as stated on the top left. In police chases, it's often the maximum duration you can spend before escaping, but with races, it signals the entire race duration. Whoever is ahead once the song ends wins the race, which can be a bit overbearing at times, and that is pretty much the loop of the game. While the writing can be quite interesting despite being a bit too angsty in a lot of places, it's still written in a way to get players curious as to what or why we're running from this so-called fear, constantly being on the move at all costs. Plus, the usage of its visuals and music to tie up with the gameplay mechanics is at the very least interesting. Although I wish it had a bit deeper gameplay mechanics, as most of the time it's you just driving on this monochrome world, dodging traffic while looking for shortcuts, escaping the cops, rinse and repeat. There are things you can do to spice it up, with the progression unlocking 4 different selectable cars, making completely different choices during a run, and the unlocking of new opportunities, threats, and new goals up until 5 acts.
So while the gameplay is lacking, its use of art style is certainly one thing other games should take note of. Going out of the monochrome world, we have this game, which is an arcade racer like the ones you would see in actual arcade cabinets, but tuned up to be played on home consoles.
Developed by Lucky Mountain Games and Sumo Digital, the same guys behind Forza Horizon 2's Xbox 360 port, Outrun 2006, and Sonic All-Stars Racing series, Hotshot Racing is by far the most arcadey experience I've had so far. At least in terms of its vibes and gameplay design, it just oozes with pure arcadey reference with a lot of callbacks to the good old classics. This game even features split screen for local multiplayer, and somehow the multi-million budget titles can't even make one. The game also has an 8-player online mode if you'd like to just race with offshore friends, but for single player, the game itself features the time trial and Grand Prix mode for those who prefer the classic style of gameplay, with the simple races and challenges. But they've also added other modes such as Cops and Robbers and Drive or Explode as a bit of more experimental new race types. The options within these modes range from the drivers with 8 characters from different nationalities, with their own personality, stats, cars, and endings to their stories, which has been delivered akin to a fighting game arcade mode with a small glimpse into the character's life after the events of the race. And for the different cars, each can be visually tuned to match whatever you want them to look. As per usual, they are not licensed, but these ones strike a very matching resemblance to some of the bigger names you've heard before, with each vehicle having differing stats between speed, acceleration, and drifting. As an extra, each car also has their own achievements or missions you can achieve for some rewards. While going after these, you can also get some cash and spend it for visual upgrades I've mentioned before. The sense of speed itself is quite blisteringly fast. Like very fast. It gets even faster with the addition of nitrous bars that everyone can earn from slipstreams and drifting, and the opponents are equally ruthless. They'll just ram you off the road if it means getting into first place. No, you cock! Which oftentimes can lead to a death via timer. Luckily, there's a grace period where the timer runs out. Reach a checkpoint after 0 and it will still continue, although your chances of winning are pretty much almost gone completely. Due to the arcadey nature itself, the game allows itself to go a bit crazy with some of its designs, giving a very colorful and vibrant scenery to speed through, each with their different layout that will really test your mastery of the game's physics.
And honestly, that's pretty much all I can tell you about this. The rest you'll have to try out for yourself or with your buddies. It's just pretty much that. Simple yet fun. No overcomplicated stuff about it. It's a similar manner for this next title as well, with the only difference being the perspective.
Circuit Superstar is one of those rare SimK titles with a top-down view and very easy to master arcade handling. This title itself has a couple of things to talk about, but let's start with the gameplay. They'll often have a main race and qualifying. The latter puts every racer in a single neat line racing through the entire track for a lap, just to determine who gets to start where. Considering how quick it is, this feels like a very good implementation for a qualifying system, but more importantly the Grand Prix collection. And you'll probably notice the resources you have to keep track of at the bottom left, being car durability, fuel consumption, and tire wear. For winning both qualifiers and race days, we get player EXP, leveling up and unlocking new cars to play around with. And this is where the developers decided to go ham a bit in a sense, as most of the cars are, let's just say, not exactly what you expect for the usual motorsport. In a way, this game has a very similar progression loop with Hotshot Racing. The game's primary selling point is by simply being a very simple game anyone can just pick up, relax, and play at a leisurely pace. Progression simply devolves into beating each cup one by one, racking up EXP on the way, unlocking more unique cars to play around with in free play, time trial, online, and future cups.
That pretty much encapsulates everything this game has to offer. But there are ways to make a top-down racing game more interesting, like with the case with our next game here.
For example of this, let's look at Super Woden GP, a game taking a lot of heavy inspirations to familiar titles, especially coming from the old era of Gran Turismo titles. Just look at how the gameplay itself is presented with its world map, designed to make you feel at home in this motorsport world, just without the licensed car because, well, it's an indie game. Unless you were to install a specific mod, that is. But that wouldn't stop the developers from making mostly accurate recreations, plenty of cars and manufacturers, with many types of disciplines which will test and take you to different settings of the world. Gameplay itself pretty much behaves like a Gran Turismo title, taking you between championships after championships with different restrictions and requirements, starting you off with the average daily driver before letting you climb up the ranks of the race cars. However, due to the limited top-down view the game offers, it had to make sacrifices, one that ended up making the game grow its own charm separate from its inspirations. The handling itself is quite arcadey, with the offset of requiring players to learn how to anticipate incoming corners and keeping track of the pace notes that will be given. In most cases, regardless of the track and discipline, every player will have to learn of the Scandinavian flick technique due to how effective it is with the handling model. But if you're willing to learn a bit about how to tackle each corner, you can end up pulling some of the most satisfying drifts around corners as you weave between or use the opponents as a cushion for the exits. And if you don't, then you can expect to get a complete wreck by the end of the race, as this game surprisingly managed to have a damage mechanic even if it's not easily visible. To counter this, we can always check out the upgrading system, which is a lot more simplified with a linear level-based system, making the act of upgrading into a straightforward business. Doing so will increase the 4 stats each car has, which will help you dominate and collect stars as you participate in races. But even then, each race and championship has its own share of online leaderboards, which can give some of the more competitive players a push to be the fastest against other races online. Even if the AI themselves became a cakewalk, the visual style that has been adopted for this one is quite simple. After all, you're rarely up close to the vehicles, and therefore it has already served its purpose, yet the way it has been implemented is quite charming. Additionally, there's also extra filter effects that can be applied to emulate what it's like gaming in the 80s and 90s. A lot of the important data that you will want to know is clear and concise. The way things are presented to you is quite faithful to what you'll be familiar with, but most importantly, the simple design is in line with the way its gameplay has been designed. Both simple, yet have some level of depth that requires a keen eye to understand and utilize them. To top it off, the game itself is not afraid to play around with lighting and provides races at completely different times of day. There is no need for excess visual effects or animations happening all over the screen, yet it pretty much achieves its goal more or less.
Otherwise, this is one of those games that is a perfect example of taking stuff that has already worked, tuning it to make it more unique while remaining functional and very good. To shake things up a bit, I asked my community what other indie games should I play. This is one game I probably wouldn't have ever come across if it hadn't been mentioned.
Burnin Rubber is a series of games that has been developed since the mid-2000s, with the majority of them being playable just from the browser right now.
The thing about the Burnin Rubber games is they're like perfect jank fun to me. Like, it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to be for everyone, but it just kind of works just enough to be fun, and that's kind of what I've always liked about them.
by a small development team known as X-Form Games, with way too many different variations of the game and every other title that has been made.
Because X-Form, the developers of them, actually re-released a bunch of them. They re-released 1, 3, 4, and 5. They haven't re-released 2 yet, but there is a fan recreated version. The only problem being it runs in like 360p, because that's what those kind of applications ran in back in the day.
So to be very specific, I'm going to look into the version of the game available on Steam. The game itself is a hybrid between racing and car combat, with certain modes leaning more on one end or the other, so the variety of the game will often come with the different challenges posed for the players, whether it be for winning a race, deleting the entire enemy team, or the very weird and over-the-top boss battles that makes the game look like it's taken out of a scene from the Fast and Furious movies. Due to this, cars can be modified and equipped with several types of arsenal for different occasions, depending on how you want to serve the opponent, riddled with bullets or laser fried. Your choice, which is going to cost a bit of a fortune, but with this kind of setup you can effectively give all 4 drivers during race battles completely different sets to handle every situation or simply overwhelm with pure strength. The game's handling, however, will take some time to get used to, as it's in that weird middle line of having easy drifting, but the car also doesn't turn as well, making some of the more technical parts of the track into some of the hardest bits for racing. But when mastered, this game becomes one of the best thrill-seeking racers, weaving through the corners to cause more carnage, despite the fact that this game is not in any way too easy, as each race becomes a battle to tackle the different resources you have. Getting pickups for ammo, repairs, or a nitro boost becomes a frantic battle while collecting cash for different guns, making split-second decisions an important skill to learn. It's not as satisfying as pulling takedowns in Burnout, but it's definitely up there in terms of satisfaction, and the developers themselves did not pull much punches with how much fun they're having, from the more basic stuff like name references to some of the most bizarre and over-the-top boss battles, including the game's own crazy ending scene. You finished Burnin Rubber 5 HD, or did you? Oh no. Oh no. Chat, what is this? Chat, what is this? And that's not even covering some of the more entertaining secrets to discover.
Because this was the era of like Newgrounds and Stick Page and different things like that. And one of my favorites from that time was Burnin Rubber, because like it was really impressive, at least from my perspective, to see something like that all done in a browser.
As an alternative, there is a version of the game purely made for multiplayer, and it's as chaotic as you'd expect. Even though there's only the combat modes, it's a bit reminiscent of other combat arena car games like Twisted Metal or Vigilant 8, just with a bit more jank. Each player gets to pick their preferred vehicle and their profile, join a room, and everyone spawns in, pick up the items scattered throughout the map, then simply let the chaos commence. It's definitely one of the funnest experiences to have with a group of friends, but I do have some criticism, like how the physics itself can be a bit too janky, and since there's no proper collisions between cars, one of the players will just end up getting sent into the stratosphere without each player taking any proper damage for it. Also, some maps can be a little bit too big for the amount, like it's designed for a completely full lobby where every corner of the map would be full of individual battles, with some cars requiring some levels of grind to acquire despite its different stats, which unfortunately is not going to be as easily achievable as the game is quite empty for public matches. But considering the game itself is completely free and playable on the browser, I can't really complain too much. It is still a game I would recommend if you have some friends that are willing to have some quick chaotic fun.
Burnin Rubber 6, if you join their Discord, you can actually see like the updates and such on it. They post stuff every now and then on their channel, X-Form. They haven't put out a release date, I don't think, but it seems like it's coming out sometime this year.
And it should be noted how impressive these developers have been, considering they had to deal with the removal of Flash from browsers. But I think now it's time to deal with indie's weirdest obsession, that being rallying. Like if you just type rally on Steam, you'll get so many indie games popping up. So let's start off from this one.
Victory Heat Rally is one of those titles with an interesting art style. On the surface, it looks like a retro pixel arcade racer that plays a lot like a mix of Daytona USA and Outrun, just way faster. But its art style takes a ton of cues from many different sources and is made to mix together very well. The cars are reminiscent of Choro Q with its horizontally squished look, the menus taking a lot of inspiration from the classic Sonic titles, and the tracks themselves taken to an extreme degree. The progression itself is split into 3 different leagues, each each containing tours with many kinds of race types within them, with the ability to move around akin to the old Super Mario titles with the top-down map view. And while the game has some interesting presentations, the story itself is pretty much a basic tournament storyline. Each track having different time of day variation also helps with making each track look unique with different coloring effects, most designed to fit in with the fast-paced gameplay. They are tied to each tour with the different layouts being dependent of the type of event utilized. Sometimes it can be a simple layout because of the more unorthodox event type, but for the regular races, it can range from very simple to having a ton of designs with clear inspirations from kart racers. In general, there are normal races with mostly nameless opponents, and each tour there's usually a named rival to beat, with a special race against them taking in SP battles from TXR as an inspiration for these duels. In total, there are 12 drivers you can play as, with 3 unlocked at the start, each having their own different cars in terms of performance and visual design, although a lot of them end up sharing the same model in the actual races compared to the illustration you'd see in the garage. But this game also gave a bit more leeway with each character, as players are allowed to slightly modify the stats for any preferred playstyle. The different stats themselves is a bit of a mixed bag, as some of their scale of effectiveness can be quite limited due to the features available in the game, like how handling can easily be bypassed by the game's drifting. But then we have the speed, acceleration, and nitro power, most of which start to take higher priority, especially once you become extremely good at chaining boosts, giving this game the same sense of speed as anti-gravity racers, and you can also pull stuff like this. But of course, this kind of mastery only makes the regular races into a thrilling experience, while the special race types become the true gauntlet of skill, such as the one where you have to drive through cones, boosting through gates, etc. All of a sudden, precision becomes the priority, especially with the extremely tight requirement for gold in these events, which honestly is better if you experience them yourself. The game is definitely very good at having its own unique personality, just from art style alone, but the gameplay having such a high skill ceiling was surprising.
While Victory Heat is a good example of taking bits and pieces of many different titles, now we're going into areas of pure nostalgia with minimal influence from modern visuals, in order to mimic the vibe of what it felt to play in the 2000s.
And so next we have Old School Rally. As the name suggests, this title is heavily designed based on inspirations from games like Richard Burns Rally and Colin McRae Rally titles. That is easily spotted just from the very clear visuals designed to mimic how PS1 rally games would look like, from how it handles particles and its decoration being mostly 2D images that are made to constantly phase the camera. The only big difference is with the game's UI that definitely looks very modern and the 60 FPS cap. The career itself plays off like any straightforward rally title would, with seasonal rally events taking up to several races back to back, taking players to different corners of the world with the different handling quirks they'll have to deal with. Obtain the best time to beat everyone else, and manage the time for repairs between each race. During this page, we can also take note of the next track layout, the weather condition, and what time would be required to win the race. Other than that, the game's experience is going to be very quick as we go through each race one by one. The handling itself is in that perfect balanced mix between a rally sim and an arcade title, not being way too easy to master driving on the challenging terrain, but also not as torturous as the sim-orientated rallies, where a few mistakes can cause the season to end in a complete disaster. Although in some cases, the difficulty can be too easy due to the lenient time goal. For winning the seasons, the game will reward both cash and car for the most part, with some additional cars only unlockable from purchasing. Additionally, the game supports Steam Workshop for any additional livery that can be added from other players, as they are split into the different divisions between the Group A, S, and classics from the 60s to 70s era of rallying. It comes into play with some of the rally season limiting use to specific divisions, with some of them being open rally, allowing players to jump in whichever car they want. This is where I would also mention that the game may end up having too many race events in the later seasons, but due to how rapid the game is at sending players between races, it can be a bit of an enjoyable gauntlet. The only big criticism would probably be with how overly simplistic the game's damage system is, as there's not much damage simulation based on the different damage parts, just a simple performance damage.
But don't let the oversimplicity take your interest. This is a very solid title for its purposes of recreating the simple and fun dynamic from the classic rally games, which is coincidentally what the next title also does, but due to different circumstances.
Hashtag Drive Rally is a game that seems to be an improved version of the developer's previous title Hashtag Drive, which is available on the Nintendo Switch and mobile devices. By comparison, it pretty much has the same art style and aesthetics, but everything from the gameplay and presentation has been expanded to have way more options or depth for players to dip their toes into. For starters, the career itself is separated into several different teams, each having a different co-driver, which you will hear a lot during the game.
This race is a song.
Different locations and tracks to tackle, different cars, although they don't seem to handle differently. Each team's progress is tracked via this logbook, reminiscent of Dirt 2's career progression. Here you can keep a track of events and rewards that can be unlocked, with most of them being a visual part for the different cars, most of which you can also buy for the arcade mode. The game mostly features the straightforward rally events, but the decision regarding its detail are a bit bizarre. The game itself is very arcadey, with not much simulation-esque features to take note of, but the game's presentation also tries to make it feel like a serious racer with the lack of music during races. Instead, most of the audio is used for the co-driver's pace notes, as it is purely audio. It's a weird decision that kind of feels like they're a bit conflicting on each other, whether the game wanted to be more of a simcade or full arcade experience, but I can't really say the developers didn't put any thought or effort into this. They even bothered to animate the co-drivers based on their reactions and dialogue, and unlocking new tracks doesn't just come from simple races, as the game also features an open world exploration mode, which can be helpful to get used with the game's handling, next to the collectible galore for the unlockables, which seems to take a lot of inspiration from Art of Rally's approach in a sense, even having a camera that can closely resemble them even if it's not exactly one-to-one.
Regardless of its arcadey handling and the difficulty not being that high even on the highest settings, it's a perfectly chill experience just to play, zoom around, and also listen to your buddy Juan. And it makes sense why Drive Rally would get some inspiration from Art of Rally, as it's right now the most impressive indie racing game to date.
But just for simply being a game with extraordinary attention to details, Art of Rally, by every definition of the word, is a masterpiece. A game which presents itself as a very simplistic homage to the world of rallying, while taking some eye-turning choices like with its camera placement. While it technically falls under the top-down view, the view is not entirely focused on the close-quarter racing, instead taking a bit of a zoom out so players can see the environment instead. And this design is a very good decision, as it hits two birds with one stone. It allows the environment design to really shine as players get to look at the surroundings, but it also allows the developer to let player focus on the road by just paying attention to the visuals. As a result, there's no need for pace notes to ruin the minimalistic aesthetic with icons in the middle of the screen, and there's no need for audio that can clash with the game's amazing soundtrack. The majority of progression itself is presented in a very simple style of going through the eras of rallying, from the 1960s with Group 2 up to Group A in the 90s, starting from slower cars mixed with a more simpler track design to give players a chance to learn and master the controls. As the group progresses, cars become much faster, more complicated layout, and more variables like advanced weather gets introduced, significantly ramping up the difficulty and required mastery of the game's handling. On the surface, the game's driving may look arcadey enough to pick up, but once you actually get your hands on it, the simcade experience immediately kicks in. It's generally a really good mix of both, as the game is not so hard to make it way too punishing despite having its own ideas of car damage, but it's not so easy that anyone can just win from the get-go. Some form of mastery of the handling will be necessary, as a lot of the corners open up to a lot of rally cornering techniques you can think of. The damage system can also be set as an additional difficulty setting, or some Samiya roleplay, or the ability to drive a flaming meatball. While the game itself can be quite easy on the lower end, on any difficulty higher than normal, any small mistake can be the difference between finishing first or not. It is not exactly necessary, as finishing in the top 3 is still enough to progress, with each season clearly rewarding in new cars and remaining restart attempts rewarding extra liveries to play with most of the cars themselves being very close recreations of rally legends of their dedicated era, making it clear just how much of a reverence the developer has of rally culture as a whole, including some of the liveries to match. You can also make custom liveries by modding them in, or by finding them via the website that has been made accessible from that menu. There is nothing along the lines of an economy. Everything is earned simply by progression. It goes to show for the rest of the game, the developer truly understood which aspect of the game should be simple, and the only thing that needed any form of depth to it should be the physics. It gives the community a drive to master the game's handling at the highest difficulty, while those that are around for the vibes and casual fun don't have to overthink about the amount of resources to deal with. The most that even contains that kind of stuff is the collectibles in the open world section of the game, where you can just cruise around, learn more of the game's handling at a leisurely pace, while scouring the map for the collectibles, which can be used to unlock new music, new free roam maps, a couple of beautiful looking shots, and the developer van for some achievement. Art of Rally tells you what it's titled, The Pure Art of Rally. It's a game that cannot exist in the AAA market space, not by choice, but rather the nature of the AAA industry in our current time. It stands as one of the peaks of indie gaming, of the racing genre, an example that you don't need high budgets, overcomplicated designs to create a deep and meaningful piece of art. If you somehow haven't played this, I would genuinely recommend this whether you are or aren't a fan of racing games, as there's always something in this game that will stick with you, whether it's the visuals, the music, or the deep homage of rally culture embedded within. The next game, however, takes the rally formula and goes batshit insane with some of its ideas. Going against the grain of being a homage to classic rally games, it instead opts to add a lot of crazy tracks in a rally game thus far. A perfectly weird title to end the rally train. It's a game about doing rallies in a parking garage, and its gameplay is definitely as weird as its concept and idea. The form of depth in this game can be seen from the drift boost mechanic, giving you that extra push after each corner. But each track has its own weird quirks and designs to make it unique from one another. For example, every one of them will have a weird layout created by a long line of parked cars taking the role of barriers, although you can't just crash into them and move them around. And the layout itself is not exclusively only the parking lot itself. A lot of them will have additional bits to take them into more creative track design, like connecting a parking lot to bits of a roller coaster track, or having a dirt trail connect to the upper portion of a parking lot. Some of them will also change layouts on specific laps to create additional obstacles, and the other is that it feels like your car is filled by a full tank of helium. Like the cars are floaty, but not to the point of being uncontrollable, just that it can be a bit weird whenever getting airtime, which we're gonna have to deal with in the career mode, where we get to race through all 8 tracks in 3 different classifications. Each race can be done as a normal or endurance race, with the latter being akin to the standard arcade time trial mode, each having goals to achieve for the bronze, silver, and gold targets. Beat each track and the next one unlocks until the next classification, and simply repeat until everything is dominated. While the car selection and customization itself is a bit limited, this game does feature one unique piece of content to add the roster with some wacky options. You can see my inputs as well. Oh god. Just like with Hotshot Racing, this game is essentially just pretty simple fun. While there isn't much overcomplicated mechanics to be mentioned, the game's way of handling physics and track design gives a ton of room for depth. Thanks to the existence of online leaderboards, you can get addicted to this with the time trial mode, just like in Trackmania games. Similarly, it would be the kind of mindset brought in for a game called Zeepkist.
Zeepkist? Say no more, Dove. I'll take it from here. To start off, Zeepkist is not some kind of Dutch wizardry spell. It's simply the word for soapbox, which should be a dead giveaway on what the game is about. Instead of the regular engine-powered vehicles, we race in soapbox cars powered by gravity. Similar to some of the indie games shown here, Zeepkist uses a very simplistic art style with some really nice and cozy designs while still allowing for plenty of variety. But don't let its cute aesthetics fool you, the game's simple premise is exactly what gives it a very high skill ceiling, and before you know it, you're hunting those overtimes as if you're playing Trackmania. Like this. Oh, hold up. Yo, no way, no way. Like that game, however, there are some different things you need to worry about. For example, this game has remarkably well-made tire physics, and if you fail to stick a landing or find yourself flying towards a wall or tree, well... The fact that there's no engine also makes you think differently on how you take certain lines. Do I keep a short line to cover as little distance as possible, or do I try to gain more momentum so I can carry it through the rest of the course? This turns momentum into an essential resource that sometimes forces you to completely rethink the way you play this racing game. But if you accidentally or intentionally find yourself off the beaten path, there is no need to worry, as there is also a ton of items located on almost every map, which you also get by obtaining medals and achievements. These allow you to customize your character in Zeepkist, and since there's a lot, you can spend many hours losing yourself and or your sanity on getting all of these items. They also highlight how this game is proud of being shamelessly Dutch, but in a way that even a Belgian friend of mine can live with it. And as a Dutch person myself, I highly approve of this propaganda piece disguised as a racing game. The maps have also got a good learning curve to them, starting with teaching you smooth controls and the aforementioned momentum techniques to more unusual tricks, like how you can gain more airtime by raising the character's arms. And when this game gets difficult, it really gets difficult. Sometimes also due to the game's physics, but that's caused more by Unity itself rather than the game's developer, who also seems to constantly have an active involvement in the game's community. But lastly, one massive benefit of it being on Unity must come from the game's custom track editor. Mostly based on the same tools used by the developer, this allows players to make their own tracks that would look as if they were part of the main campaign. In fact, there's already a ton of custom tracks available just from the Steam Workshop alone. But I'm running out of time here, so I'll personally do a deep dive into this game later. All you need to know now is that this is a criminally underrated game, especially for those who are looking for a similar experience to Trackmania. So get out there and spread the word about what a real Dutch racing game looks like. This has been Midship RXP on Zeepkist, reporting live from the Netherlands. Back to you, Duffington.
Well, I couldn't explain it better myself. Big thanks to Xbus for taking over, and you can subscribe to his channel for that deep dive into what Zeepkist is. But it's time to move on to the next game.
Similarly, the next game has also been designed to cater to an audience that Nintendo has abandoned.
Aero GPX is a title developed as a homage and love letter to F-Zero specifically, mimicking a lot of the visual language and gameplay of said title, while using a cell shading technique that puts its style closer to games such as Hi-Fi Rush and keeps the style as dynamic as possible to fit the rapid gameplay. The game itself generally has a similar amount of gameplay depth to the F-Zero games, each stage having carefully placed locations to both heal and refill the boost, with characters having their own performance and stats to choose from, allowing each to shine with different tactics in the races. Whether you're the straight-laced racer or the kind that responds in violence, you can also toggle the menu to give a complete stat info, although some may need a bit of explanation to even be understood. And this game is very fast. Even in the slower parts, you'll want to keep a sharp mind as the numerous racers on the track can easily create a ton of chaotic moments, especially due to the machines becoming nigh uncontrollable when getting into collisions, with some of the more interesting track designs to make use of verticality, a mix between speed, combat, and survival. A ton of layouts designed to make players learn and take advantages of things like boost stacking, knowing when to do aerial drill for speed buildup, or to just play it safe, allowing for weird layouts split into several divisions, locking the other different characters as well throughout. These divisions are the way to progress in the game, with progress being tied to the difficulty chosen for each activity. Some can be specific challenges locking you into a set character into a 1v1 scenario, single races, time trial, takedown battle, or Grand Prix. And to keep things as simple as possible, there is no cash or features to upgrade the vehicles themselves. That way the multitude of characters can fully shine within each of their own niche. The game is still in early access as we speak, so there will be more updates for both stages and tracks, which will add into the career progression as well. This art style is also beneficial to playing around with colors and particle effects, directly informing players of what is currently going on with their vehicle, whether you're boosting, drifting, taking damage, or on the offensive. Aero GPX is simple, yet it's also bombastic and fast. Very fast. It is the epitome of an arcade racer, one that's worthy of its reputation as the modern F-Zero Nintendo wouldn't provide. At the moment, it's only missing some of the details that made its inspirations charming, like the extremely goofy character storylines, but if you're interested in the gameplay, I would still recommend this. So here's hoping for a smooth development for the future of this game.
While we're on the topic of early access indie titles, I think this title is fitting for it as well. Let's take us to the scenes of Japanese highway racers.
Nightrunners' own overall gameplay is not too different compared to the Tokyo Extreme Racer series, as it all comes down to the details. While Genki likes to populate its highway with rivals to challenge, Nightrunner uses its highway purely for racing and some bit of exploration. Challenging rivals can only be done from the parking areas, with most of the races being straight point-to-point races, or sometimes drag races that can take you to the very blistering fast speeds. Collisions will drop the speed significantly, which really highlights how important avoiding traffic becomes. The progression itself comes from a somewhat balanced bunch of rivals that will ramp up in both performance and betting amount, with the game's prologue putting players in debt with the Yakuza due to an altercation with one of your former friends, and so money becomes the vocal point of the game's progression, with the first phase of the game requiring players to earn enough to pay off their debt, limiting the amount of money that can be thrown into personal upgrades, while losing can mean getting into an even bigger debt than what it was originally. Luckily, there's a chance for rivals to ask for a rematch with double bets, which may or may not feed into the gambler's mindset, but it's also generally a feature that's useful for immediately starting a race after another one, as the game will always drop players in the middle of nowhere after a race. You could also fast travel back to any point of interest for a bit of cash and rep multiplier. For what is available at the moment are a couple of rivals, most coming from the same crew, as you claw your way up for cash and rep, unlocking faster and richer rivals to be challenged, and once you climb up the ladder to the leader, they will give an invitation to join, adding a brand new dynamic that was rarely available in the racing genre. It differentiates itself a lot from the clear inspirations of Tokyo Extreme Racer and Wangan Midnight Maximum Tune just from the gameplay alone. It takes a lot of aspects of both titles and tries to make it work with a creative flair on top. In addition, Nightrunners is different in how it's portrayed, utilizing a lot of film grain and emulation of the old 90s recording style, mimicking those videos of old Japanese street racing scenes, giving a certain level of edge just from the presentation, with how secretive the whole used car market is depicted, with some questionable quality assurance. The way characters are portrayed, speak, and behave alongside the mostly dark roads of the game, you may think that this game is trying to showcase the seedy and dangerous side of street racing with everything shown so far. Not quite. The overall edge of the game wears off as you progress. Crashes, no matter how brutal it may seem, will just reset you with no damage system implemented. Most rivals turns into pushovers once you have at least beaten them once, modeled with very simplistic depictions. Their illustrations being simple monochromatic drawings that often block their face from view, and 3D models used for spectators are made using flat models with their faces being censored to add a bit more of that immersion. It is an art style choice that puts a lot of focus on the cars, as this game's sense of speed goes up very quickly. Obtaining cars themselves in this game is kind of similar to the usual dealership method, except you'll be buying them from a very seedy black market-ish type. Each car has its own conditions and drawbacks. Due to the car's limited transmission, you should absolutely pay attention to whether a car is automatic or manual from the point of purchase, as there's no way to modify it afterwards, but also this game has quite the extensive car customization features. The ability to upgrade, change, or remove almost every single bit of the car is one that is rarely seen, as things like removing parts can also be beneficial to reduce weight. It adds a lot of depth into customizing, whether you want to just simply race out or be one of the most efficient racers on the street. At the moment, the selection itself is still limited. However, subs to the developer's Patreon can receive an updated build featuring a couple of cars that would be available in the full release later. So I would give this game a recommendation, as it's currently available as a free demo on Steam. It should be an interesting experience for those unfamiliar with the highway racing subgenre, and for those who may want to compare it to the new Tokyo Extreme Racer coming this year.
Throughout this video, we've seen a big variety of indie racing games, but to say we scratched the surface would be an overstatement. As the tools grow to streamline the process of video game development, so do the ambitious projects become a reality. As such, everything in this video barely scratches the surface of what is available, and hopefully we'll see more of that amazing side that can come out of developers when they simply let their passion push them forward, and perhaps we can get some of the greatest racing games out there that will never hit the mainstream market. But that leaves a few questions. Have you tried out any of these titles mentioned in this video? What are your thoughts about them, and are there any games that I might have missed out on? Do let me know in the comments down below, and thank you again for watching this video. These videos do take quite a bit of time to make, so if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon page in the link down below. For a few dollars, you can get early access to all my future videos. And of course, this is all optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but if you feel like it, there's always a link down below. And with that, thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a great day.